Okie dokie, welcome to another installation of Billy's Books. Today, it's Grant by Ron Chernow. Ron Chernow, you may know, he wrote the book about Alexander Hamilton, the inspiration for the Hamilton musical, which you may have heard of. So Ron Chernow wrote Hamilton in the early noughties, and then around 2012 or something, he came out with Washington, which I also read and I also recommend. And now this guy, Grant. So, you may have heard of him, U.S. Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, the war hero from the Civil War and also United States President too after Lincoln. He was a war hero. He was competent and cool-headed in battle where many other generals were not. He was thorough and planned things out in a way that was rather cold-hearted from the loser's side of things. By the way, he was on the U.S. side, not the traitor's side. He was raised he had an interesting, his parents, his dad was sort of a little bit of a crazy guy who used Ulysses' fame to his advantage. He was always looking for attention. The opposite of that was his mom, who was like a really heavy-duty abolitionist, and she was very cold all the time. She never showed any affection, and Ulysses is known for being very quiet, and they think it may have something to do with his relationship to his mom, since his dad was embarrassingly gregarious. When he finally got married, he married I think Julia was her name, but her parents were Southern and in St. Louis, and so his father disapproved of his father-in-law disapproved of Ulysses because he was, well, kind of low class, and also he was anti-slavery, and of course his father-in-law was pro-slavery, so they disagreed a little bit on that. They never really warmed up to that too much. Even when Grant became president, his father-in-law would hold court in the White House and shoot his mouth off constantly about Southern heritage and things like that, and Grant just put up with it. I guess because he loved his wife or whatever. I'm not quite sure why he put up with that, but he put up with a lot because he was a rather stoic guy, and he also was a little bit naive about loyalty to a fault. And so when he finally got into power, into the White House, he turned a blind eye to some of the corruption because he believed all of his close friends were on the up and up and legitimate, whereas they really actually were just kind of using him. When he was a young officer in the Army, he didn't do very well, and he is known for having been an alcoholic. He was indeed diagnosed as alcoholic. That was considered a sin back there. Now we understand it as a disease, but back then he was just seen as decadent and selfish. And he did go on drinking bouts, but he always managed to do it when it didn't matter. He would never, so for example, during the war, he was on the battlefield a lot, and he is known for having never been drunk on the battlefield. What he would do would be he would endure the battlefield, he would win battles, and then when it was all over, he'd sneak into town and do a bender, and then that would end up in the news. And that haunted his entire career, not just as an Army officer, but also his political career. There were always hints that he was drinking. Of course, he had a right-hand man, whose name I can't recall, who did his darndest to keep him from drinking, and also whenever he was with his wife, she kept him from drinking too. So he made sure to surround himself with people that would keep him out of trouble, but every now and then he'd slip out, and he'd do it. And it made him feel terrible, but that's the life of the alcoholic, I suppose. He was, once again, never known for being very emotional, except with his family. So he would be known as being very stoic, but when he was with his family, he would warm up to it because he just loved his children. He loved his children too much, some would argue. Anyway, so he beat Robert E. Lee. They didn't actually meet until the very end of the war, and I'm going to give you a little quote for his meeting with Robert E. Lee. Where is it now? Okay. I felt like anything but rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause. though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought, and one for which there was the least excuse. So he hated the Confederacy to a core, but he still was actually relatively civil to the citizens, if you will, of the Confederacy. He understands that, you know, the poor people are just enduring, and it's the rich people that usually declare the wars for their own advantage. You get poor people to fight for the rich people's property. So Robert E. Lee also was an interesting character because he was a Confederate. He joined the Confederacy out of his devotion to his home state of Virginia rather than because he believed in disunion, which is interesting. He believed in slavery, so Robert E. Lee was a reluctant soldier, but he did it, and he did fight, and so he was the scene described in this book of when Grant and Lee met is a very interesting scene because, you know, Grant would try to break the ice sometimes, and like, so that was a good battle you did back there, and Lee was having none of it. He's just like, cut to business, nothing but business here, and as soon as we're done, I'm going to leave. You know, so he was like, and he never ever smiled or anything like that. He was not surprisingly, very unhappy. After the war, when Grant became president, his presidency was fairly or unfairly, depending on how you look at it, associated with corruption, even though he himself was trying to push forward some reform, make it more of a meritocracy than an autocracy. But because of his a naive relationship to his friends and associates and from the army and personal life, he looked right past things that should have been staring him in the eye, and he sometimes saw cleanliness where there was corruption, so that kind of was a problem for him. He also, what else? For example, and so people, like his father and his son both, his father used his name to an advantage, but also his son, who he thought wasn't a very good military guy, still ended up going to West Point, his son Fred. And Fred turned out to be a real bastard. He would just like he was a bad student, apparently 41 out of 41, 41st out of 41 for the academics. And also, they had their first black cadet in West Point, and Fred took it upon himself to pick on this guy, pick fights with him, and then when they got in a big fight, they both got in trouble, and Fred got his daddy to make sure that the black cadet was thrown out. 2 years later, that black former cadet died of tuberculosis. He also had trouble, his dear, sweet, lovely daughter Nellie, he was his favorite, of course. Daddy's little girl, she fell in love with a Brit who turned out to be, his instincts suggested, oh, I don't know about this guy, but because he was so nice, he let her get married, and when they got married afterwards, they found Grant crying quietly in her room. And then it turned out he was a bastard who squandered all of his money and slept with other women and all sorts of good things, leading to a most ruinous situation, which is all quite the big bummer. He was just too nice. There was a great crash in the 70s, 1870s, and that led to what they called at the time the Great Depression, which lasted 5 years and was the greatest depression until the 1930s Great Depression, which stole that name, never to be returned. And so what they did back then, things were much more primitive back then as far as economics are concerned, and Congress passed a bill to just print up a whole bunch more money, which got nicknamed the inflation bill for obvious reasons. And there were strong voices on both sides for and against it, and there was a lot of pressure on him to sign that bill. He eventually opted to veto it, which took a lot of strength, and he later on congratulated himself, patted himself on the back for doing the right thing. Economists today question whether it was the right thing to do, but it seemed to have worked at the time to not add inflation. We don't know what would have happened if they had signed the bill, if things would have gone differently, but that's the way that is. Yeah, he's a really interesting character. Ron Chernow himself has said of all the characters he's written about, all the different historical figures, that actually Grant is his favorite. I think that's because he had such a good heart, and he actually did good things. He, just so you know, he was in the Reformation. He came. So Lincoln was killed, and then Lincoln's vice president was Andrew Johnson, who was also a drunk but a real jackass, and kind of undermined most of Lincoln's things towards Reformation. So when Grant stepped in for Reformation, he really tried to make it work, despite the fact that the entire South was against him. He actually sent troops back down into the South after the war to get them to stop killing people. And they didn't just kill black people; they killed all the Republicans. Any basically, or at least ostracized them and terrorized them. So he sent the troops down to try to take down the Klan and all this stuff. So he was considered a friend of the black man, where there were few others at that time. Oh yes. So there you are. Even though he wasn't perfect, since of course he did come to his son's defense when he probably shouldn't have. So he's definitely a guy filled with contradictions. His contradictions are interesting, and they definitely are part of history. So check out this book. It's pretty thick. It's taken me all summer to read it, and we're in late October now, so there you are. Just remember, if you can't do, review.